Hubhopper Originals.
To start your podcast for free, log on to studio.hubhopper.com.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Indian Genes. I'm your host, Joaquin Gonsalves, and today we have a truly captivating guest who is a prolific author, renowned science writer, and an expert in his field. With an impressive 14 books under his belt, including his latest work, Life's Edge, The Search for What It Means to Be Alive. He delves into the depths of scientific exploration and invites us to question the very existence of life itself. As a writer of the acclaimed Origins column for the New York Times, he has earned numerous accolades throughout his career, and his exceptional work has been recognized with prestigious awards, including the esteemed Stephen Jay Gould Prize presented by the Society for Study on Evolution. It comes as no surprise that his books have received widespread acclaim. 3 of his literary creations have been named Notable Books of the Year by the New York Times Book Review, showcasing his remarkable ability to engage readers with his insightful and thought-provoking narratives. One particular gem, She Has Her Mother's Laugh, went on to win numerous awards and was also hailed as the best science book of 2018 by The Guardian. Additionally, as a professor at Yale University, he imparts his vast knowledge to the next generation of curious minds, nurturing the spirit of scientific inquiry. What sets him truly apart is the extraordinary honor of having both a species of tapeworm and an asteroid named after him. So here at Indian Genes, we now very proudly present a remarkable gentleman in this exclusive interview, none other than Carl Zimmer. So Carl, from everyone here in India and Indian Genes, a very, very big welcome to you. Thank you so much for sparing some of your time. I know you are a very busy man, but speaking to all of us here in India, we have a lot of students who probably are going to take a lot away from what you are going to be saying today. We also have a lot of non-experts here. So this is more of a platform where we get to hear from notable speakers like you, clarify a lot of our doubts. So once again, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for having me.
So my question to you is, when I was growing up, there was this song in 1984, I think it was 1984, by a band called Opus. And the name of that song, it was a very popular song, is Life is Life. So have you, and have all of us collectively moved forward from there, or is this song still very relevant?
Well, I think that's a pretty good definition. There's something that we refer to as life, and we all kind of feel like we know what it is. So that's good enough for just conversation. But as something that that scientists study and can define, we're actually not able to define it in a way that scientists all agree on. Scientists have come up with a lot of definitions. It's very easy to find them, and there are hundreds of them, literally hundreds. And there are new ones that pop up every year, and it doesn't seem like they're converging. It doesn't seem like they're narrowing down to just one. And that, I think, actually like speaks to something profound about life and how we should go about trying to understand something like life.
True. And I think the best thing to try to do that, like you have quoted in your book, because what you're trying to do is the search for what it means to be alive. And when you say the search for what it means to be alive, that to me looks like, from our perspective, from somebody who is metacognitive, because that's what we are studying, but from, for example, an animal, or for example any other living being, what it means to be alive could be something totally different, right?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that for us, when we think about our own lives, we do think about that in terms of our consciousness, and that that our brains are giving us a sense of ourselves and an awareness of reality around us. But I think that that's a bit of a there's a bit of a logical error there. Like you do need to be alive as a human being to be conscious. I think what we can all agree, that's not a very controversial thing to say. I'm
Yeah.
not so sure that a mushroom is alive. I'm sorry. I'm not so sure a mushroom is conscious. Sorry, but it's definitely alive. It definitely does
Mm,
all the kinds of things that we think of as being essential for life. So once we start to get outside of ourselves in our day to day lives, things get challenging, and even for ourselves, I mean, it can be surprisingly hard to really come up with a clear, consistent notion of the boundaries of our own lives when our own lives begin and end. And this and this so this is a question that has legal importance. In a hospital where somebody has had a massive brain injury and can be only kept alive with a ventilator, and there's no brain activity, like, w- how do we deal with that in terms of whether that
mm.
person is alive or not? Um, and then this is also a profound question for our search for life in the universe. Are we alone? I mean, can there be a bigger question than that? But if we're not even agreeing on what life is, then how can we go and try to look for it elsewhere?
True. And you brought up consciousness, and I don't know if you're aware, but there's this latest bet. It seems to have been a 25-year-old science bet between Christopher Coe and David Chalmers, where they
Yes,
betted
I was actually
25 years ago, saying,
yeah, I actually I that they actually met in New York to revisit the bet. Um, and so this was a bet between this neuroscientist Christoph Koch and this philosopher David Chalmers, that it would be possible. They made the bet 25 years ago, and Christoph Koch was betting that within 25 years, scientists would find what are called the neural correlates of consciousness. In other words, there's some sort of activity in the brain that you can associate with consciousness. And so I actually was able to make it to this event. I was there, and you know,
wow.
and they were on stage, and it was a packed house. It was like 800 people were at this auditorium at New York University, and it was a whole lot of fun. And they were recalling what it was like 25 years ago when Christoph Koch made this bet, and at the time there was a lot of enthusiasm about some of the new brain technologies, fMRI scans and things like that. And the philosopher David Chalmers was like, well, he was going to take the other side of the bet. He was skeptical, because
Mm,
partly because he just felt like we know so little about how the brain works, and what we'd still know so little about consciousness. So how can we then find a signature in the brain of consciousness when we have so much left to learn? So that was the bet, and a whole lot of things have happened since then, and a lot of theories have come out, very sophisticated theories of consciousness that are based on lots and lots of experiments. The problem is that the people who come up with these theories, that go and do their experiments, and they say, "Oh, look, my experiments support my theory," and they do another experiment, and they keep going and going and going. But like these people with these different theories, like they never seem to be converging and saying like, "Oh, well, actually, that theory is wrong and this one's right." I think there are like 40 theories of consciousness now out there. It's kind of like
yeah.
life, It's like it's just one of these things that just encourages this kind of proliferation. So what happened was that excuse me, 5 years ago, no, actually 6 years ago now, Christoph Koch, David Chalmers brought a whole bunch of scientists involved with two leading theories, brought them together, and they said, okay, let's do an experiment where each of these theories makes different predictions. and maybe we can see if one of them wins out over the other. And
Mm.
so they it's a huge effort, involved over 250 volunteers having their brains scanned. Sometimes people were having implants and electrodes implanted in their brains and so on. And they showed the results, and the results were that, well, um, in some of the experiments, it looked like one of the theories was doing better than the other. And other experiments, it looked like the second theory was doing better. So they
Yeah.
nobody was willing to back down. No one's willing to say, like, your theory's right, mine's wrong. There's more. They're going to show more of these experiments coming up. But it was fascinating. And at the end of the night, just to wrap this up, is that Christoph Koch, the bet had been the winner would get a case of vintage wine. And at the end of the evening, Christoph Koch walked out with a box full of bottles of wine and gave them to David Chalmers. And said, we don't have the neural correlates of consciousness yet. Clearly, we don't have some clear-cut signal you can see in the brain that is related to the experience of consciousness. We don't know where it is yet. We don't know what it is yet. But then he doubled down. He said, I'll make you another bet. Double or nothing. In the next 25 years, we'll do it. So they shook again. So the bet lives on.
That's such a brilliant story, in fact, and I'm really happy that you were actually there. But and from the beginning, do you think that whenever you pit, I mean, the idea that I can see here is, materialism against an idealist. It's always going to be very difficult to come out with one winner, because somebody or someone is going to go back to first principle, and something would have. So I don't know if it's going to be that easy ever.
That's a good. Well, I think well, so Christoph Koch, he's a neuroscientist at the Allen Institute in Seattle, and he is 67 now. So when he was a young neuroscientist starting out, he actually worked with Francis Crick. So Francis Crick, people may recall, won the Nobel Prize for his role in figuring out the structure and the function of DNA way back in
Mm.
1962. But actually, like, late in life, Crick decided that he wanted to do for consciousness what he had done for heredity. In other words, heredity had been a very mysterious phenomenon in the early 20th century. And, people would say, look, well, it seems like there's something that's passed, traits are influenced by something passed down through the generations. And we think that we think it's something we're going to call a gene, but they didn't know what genes were. They didn't know what they were made of. And so it almost got quite mystical, the way people would talk about heredity. And Crick was just like, look, let's just figure out, the basis of this. And, what he figured out, with the help of lots of other people, is that genes are encoded in DNA, and that the information encoded in DNA is read out by molecules in our cells. And there's a genetic code, which Crick played a big part in figuring out, which translates the language of our genes into the structure of proteins. There you go. I mean, it's no one knew that, in full before the 1960s. But once you know it, it's beautiful in its simplicity. So Crick believed there was something about consciousness that would be equally beautiful and simple. And so
Right.
he and Koch, were like, okay, let's start just by seeing if we can, design experiments, real experiments. We're not going to leave it to the philosophers anymore. We're going to do experiments that can at least give us a toehold, a grip on what consciousness is. And so that was really, that was very influential. I mean, there are lots of experiments now that people do, really trying to make sense of consciousness now. And they're well-designed experiments. They're experiments that happen in all sorts of settings. There are experiments, where people have been diagnosed in a vegetative state. They're completely unresponsive. They're in comas. Well, but are they just uncommunicative? Maybe they're conscious. And so there actually are now tests that people are developing to see if you can actually, like, judge whether people actually are conscious. So, um, but these theories do like have a different, they a lot of them are sort of based on sort of different approaches, different kinds of philosophy towards this whole question of the mind. And so, some people have questioned whether it is this kind of adversarial collaboration, as it's called, where you have advocates of two theories agree to work together. It's not clear. It's not necessarily always. These theories have to be very similar. Have to be, in other words, they have to be based on a lot of the same assumptions in order for this whole process to work. And so there are some skeptics who are wondering whether this whole thing will work. But we'll see. This is the first. This is the first. These are the first results from this kind of adversarial collaboration project that's going on. And actually, there are going to be a whole lot more. There are going to be other theories that are going to be tested against each other in the years to come. It's going to be fascinating.
True, yes, it's definitely going to be fascinating. And like you said, this may be the early stages of us getting to that. And uh, your favorite topic of life, because we went through that, and we went through a lot of early stage experiments or things that we thought, right? It started with radium, which was, you use the word mystic, but radium seemed to have, or radioactivity was very interesting at one time. And then later on, I think it was before that, before radium, it was also uranium, or uranium salts. So maybe you want to tell us the initial stages of the same thing with consciousness, but when people actually started looking for what life actually was, wasn't it something similar with these kind of theories coming up?
In the 19th century, scientists started using microscopes and chemistry to figure out what living tissue was made of. They found cells, and inside cells, they found proteins and other substances. And so that led them to say, like, well, there doesn't seem to be, physically like some difference between living matter and non-living matter. Just maybe it's somehow it's its arrangement, or maybe there's just, how is it that these atoms of nitrogen and carbon and so on produce something that's alive. Uh, I opened my book Life's Edge with a really remarkable episode where a physicist in the early 1900s uh, thought maybe the newly discovered phenomenon of radioactivity was the answer to the mystery. So he believed that if you took a radioactive element like radium, you could use that actually to create life, a sort of Frankenstein's monster. And he actually performed experiments where he took, a sort of a boiled beef broth that just contained just bits of protein and put radium in it, and claimed that cells spontaneously emerged from it. He called these radiobes. And at the time, he was quite celebrated for it. He became incredibly famous worldwide. Um, of course, it turned out he was wrong, and he plunged into obscurity again in a very tragic fall. Um, and I think his story, this scientist named John Butler Burke, I think it tells you about um, the the attraction that scientists have to this mystery of what is life, and the dangers that it poses, because people often end up being very, very wrong.
And if you're wrong, like you said, the reaction can be from the community as well, cannot be very pleasing, right?
Sure. I mean, the Carl Sagan once famously said that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and there's nothing more extraordinary than claiming that you have figured out the secret of life and that you can make it from scratch. Um, but it is also the sort of thing that we all are curious about, and that's why all of these attempts to understand life attract a huge amount of attention from the public as a whole. There's no bigger question, it is it's a question we haven't answered yet.
True, true. But just correct me if I'm wrong, because I don't know the final fact on this, but there was this Miller Urey experiment, if I'm not mistaken, and I did, or we did read reports that yes, there was something interesting in the results of the experiment. So maybe you can clarify for us, was there anything interesting at the end of those experiments, and did we reach any conclusion?
So the Miller-Urey experiments were carried out in the 50s by Stanley Miller, a researcher in California, and he was working with his mentor Harold Urey, a Nobel Prize-winning chemist. And what Miller was doing was he was trying to test a hypothesis about how life began on Earth. So he was not trying to make life entirely from scratch, but he was trying to understand whether the chemistry in the atmosphere of the early Earth could have enabled chemical reactions that could have produced some of the building blocks of life.
Mm,
And to that extent, his experiment, it was really one of the first of its kind. His experiment was a huge success because he did actually produce. Well, he basically took what he believed was, the what was in the early atmosphere on Earth, and then ran sparks through it as if that was lightning, and was able to produce all sorts of very interesting organic compounds. Now, it's a long way from those organic compounds to a cell that can feed and keep itself stable and grow and reproduce, but still, it was one of the most important experiments in the 20th century.
mm. And just to get back to what you said, what this experiment was doing was trying to figure out whether all the ingredients of life come together to form life, for example. And then you also said that he was not looking at how life formed itself, but would is are both not the same things? Because does that not have to happen for this to come together, or is there another way of looking at how life actually started?
Well, Miller was looking at a sort of a very big theory for the origin of life, which held that when the Earth formed about 4.6 billion years ago, um, it, it, it it had an atmosphere with certain compounds in it. It was at a certain temperature, a certain pH. There was an ocean that was beginning to form. So presumably there was no life there to begin with. So the question is, could the building blocks of life start to form on the early Earth? And then once they had formed, were there conditions in which they could gradually self-organize into the first forms of life? So that's a big theory, and there are a lot of different
Mm,
pieces to it. So, Stanley Miller was really just zeroing in on one part of it, an important part, but just one part. So what Miller's experiment was suggesting was like on that early Earth, you'd have, lightning storms and so on, and that chemistry that took place could actually start to produce some of the ingredients that you find in living in life as we know it. Now, there have been a lot of other scientists who have looked at other parts of the theory, and things. The whole area, question of origin of life, has a huge amount of research that's gone into it, and things are different now than they were then, in the sense that like the early Earth, the atmosphere, scientists have a better idea of what was actually in it. So when you start to do these experiments, you start from a different starting point. Um, and scientists have been zeroing in on other parts of that theory, like, well, could you, for example, get genetic molecules to form before there were cells that could contain them? And there's some remarkable experiments I write about in my book where it looks like, actually it does look as if, the molecule RNA does seem to be able to grow and to get replicated in a very crude way, without needing cells for it to do it. So there are, we certainly don't have the full story of how life began all worked out. I don't know if we ever will. I mean, no, but there are a lot more pieces to the puzzle now than there were back then.
True, and it's very interesting when, and especially in your book, the way you've put it across, and you've gone through the initial stages, and I'm still there at the moment, and that got me thinking as well, because you did mention about these early stages, and I think you spoke a lot. You also spoke, or you covered protoplasm, and I was trying to understand whether this was the early stage you were talking about, or whether the protoplasm that you were talking about was within the cell, because we also thought about some kind of substance that permeated across the globe, or whether it was in the oceans, if I'm not sure, right? And these
Hmm.
are two different things that were very interesting that I read.
Yeah. As scientists started to look inside of cells and try to figure out what was in there, um, they they realized that cells contain a lot of different molecules inside their membranes or their walls, and but they seem to be sort of encased in a sort of almost a jelly-like substance, and this came to be known as a protoplasm. So there was this feeling that uh, th- that this jelly-like substance was really like that was the primordial stuff of life, because you can find it in our cells, you can find it in a plant cells, you can find it inside bacteria. It's everywhere. So there was a feeling, I mentioned that there was this vital force that people were talking about. So some people thought somehow protoplasm contained this mysterious vital force. And so so that was kind of the thinking that people had in the mid 1800s. And this was also right at the time where there were early oceanographic voyage research voyages starting. This is really the first time that sort of the modern science of oceanography was getting started. And so you had these ships that would go out, and they would be throwing down probes to scoop up samples from the seafloor, way, way, way down, a mile or more underwater. And when they would bring it up and scientists would analyze it, it looked as if there was a sort of a jelly-like substance in there. And people say, "My goodness, this is protoplasm. This is," and they would say like, "Well, it looks as if there's this protoplasm is forming a kind of a continuous carpet on the seafloor." um and so it wasn't, it wasn't really in cells, it was just somehow just laid out. And one of the greatest biologists of the 19th century, Thomas Huxley, he looked at this and he said, well, this is actually a living thing. This needs its own name. He gave it a name. He called it Bathybius. And so suddenly, like when people are trying to understand what is life and trying to understand how did life begin, where's the beginning of evolution, suddenly it seemed like this was it, Bathybius. It's there, it's still there, it's lurking around on the seafloor. Um, it turned out that this was all wrong. It was bad chemistry that people were carrying out, and Huxley was fooled. And it was very embarrassing for him. But to his credit, as soon as his colleagues said, I think you made a mistake," he immediately just brought that to the public's attention. He got those results published as quickly as he could, and he said, "Well, I this is my mistake." And so I think that's one of the reasons why Thomas Huxley is still, admired today, whereas some other people who dabbled in the question of what is life have plunged into obscurity.
Mm. No, that's such an amazing story, and like you mentioned, what Huxley did at the end there, probably did so much more for science in the long run and held up the respect that we have for the scientific method, because no matter what, if you can put your hand up there and say, okay, this is what I thought, but the facts just don't line up, and now I am wrong, that itself for a person in the spotlight is very difficult to do. And I think because of people like him and because of situations or events that have happened in the past, that's why all of us believe in it. But uh, I think that's a very difficult thing to do. But also at the other end, that's why all of us, we put our trust and faith in it.
I mean, this was, this was at the time where, some of the rules of modern science were really being worked out. How how does a community of scientists try to learn about the world? How, what is the nature of the scientific method of making a hypothesis, of coming up with a good experiment? How do you share those results? How do you decide whether those results support or weaken a hypothesis, and so on? Yeah, so I mean, it's really interesting to go back and to see that starting to play out with these questions about what is life.
True. And in all your research, when you looked at these regions and we moved past the initial cells, did the Cambrian explosion, or what we've heard of at that time, where we moved from probably singular cells to much more complex organisms all of a sudden, did you find, or do you find that interesting at all, or do you think there is something more we need to understand about it?
The the Cambrian explosion is a really fascinating, case study in really the history of science. Because sometimes something looks a certain way because scientists have only gotten a small amount of information about it, and as they get more information, it changes. So, so when Charles Darwin was working on his theory of evolution, he looked very much to geology and paleontology and the fossil record to try to see if it fit his idea that life evolved, that new species evolved from old ones through a gradual process, including natural selection. And so when he looked at the fossil record, he saw lots of fossils and he saw a lot of good evidence that was consistent with his theory. Um, but when he looked at the layers of rocks, he was a very good geologist. Basically, you go down to the Cambrian, this period of time, which had fossils, lots of animal fossils. But below that, in the older rocks, no one had found any animal fossils. And so he said, well, I mean, there could be a lot of reasons for this. You know, fossils don't, why, fossils will get preserved in certain conditions and get destroyed in other conditions. It's also, we only know the fossil record because people have gone out and looked for it. And so we just have to keep looking as well. He likened it to like a vast, incomplete museum, the fossil record. Um, so that was, over 150 years ago. So now, so at the time, the oldest animal fossils were, maybe 550 million years old, something like that. So now paleontologists have found much older animals, Precambrian animals. So the fossils are there.
Hmm.
In addition, there are lots and lots of Precambrian fossils of other forms of life, of algae and of bacteria. In fact, the oldest, clearly accepted evidence of bacteria is, I think, was about 3.4 billion years old now. Um, so that's, I mean, so that's like, what is it? That's like 7 or 8 times older than the Cambrian. So the fossil record, broadly defined, is vast, and it turns out like animals, evolved pretty late. Um, w- Now, what our scientists are doing is that they're not just looking for like the skeletons, or the soft tissue of in fossils, but chemical markers. Um, Actually, like living things, they have an unusual chemistry, and some of those molecules get preserved in ancient rock, and so scientists are actually finding some of those ancient biomarkers. And it looks like there are some ancient biomarkers of animals like sponges that go way back. I mean, I'd have to double check. I think about 700 million years. There are biomarkers of protozoans that go back well over 1 billion years. So we have this very rich, um, much richer picture of the history of life. So, initially it looked like the Cambrian was this quote unquote explosion, but that was
Mm,
really just because scientists had not yet really started to pull back the curtain on Precambrian life. It's still very interesting what happened in the Cambrian because it's clear that animals already existed at the start of the Cambrian. In the Cambrian, it seems like they diversified a lot. It seems
mm.
like a lot of the different, major groups of animals alive today got their start in the Cambrian. So why was that? And well, that's a good, it's a tough uh, question. It's a good question, and there are a lot of hypotheses that scientists are now testing. It turns out that at the beginning of the Cambrian and a little before that was a very turbulent time in physical history of Earth. Um, Lots of changes. There might at some one point the Earth may have been entirely covered in ice. There were massive swings in the amount of oxygen in the ocean. So these may all have played a role in driving the diversification of animals which were already there.
Right. And interestingly, you brought up bacteria, and I've always wanted to ask somebody this, so I think you're the perfect person. So, is bacteria life according to you? Do
Yeah.
you consider bacteria as, or does there have to be metabolism, or is there some other feature that you would say it's necessary for you to consider it as life?
Well, I mean, I am not, I am not the judge and jury of what life is. And in Life's Edge, I am telling the story of people, scientists, philosophers, and others who have struggled with trying to figure this out. So I am not here to pass judgment. But certainly there are something hallmarks of life that come up again and again in these discussions. One is metabolism. In other words, taking in food and turning it into biological matter. Homeostasis, that's the stability. Like the environment around you is changing all the time, but you're inside the conditions stay stable. A simple example is our body temperature. How do we keep that stable when the temperature is changing outside of us? So metabolism, homeostasis, reproduction, and evolution. It's like those are, I would say, four of the really big hallmarks. There, people may have others that they like. That's fine. But you ask about bacteria, they do all that. They do, bacteria metabolize. Bacteria, like, I mean, if you just look at all the different species that we know of on Earth, I mean, bacteria eat anything, just anything. They live off of anything. They're unbelievable. We are incredibly boring compared to the bacterial world when it comes to metabolism. They some of them actually use radioactivity as part of how they generate fuel for their cells. Uh, so uh, so there's a whole universe of metabolism with bacteria. Do they evolve? Of course they evolve. That's why antibiotics are not working very well. Homeostasis, like they are able to survive and have survived for billions of years through all sorts of extreme circumstances. And reproduction. I mean, you just when you see bacteria spreading on a petri dish, there it is. I mean, they like there are some bacteria like E. coli that under the right conditions can duplicate every 20 minutes. In fact, like if they were able to just keep growing at that rate, we would be all drowning in bacteria, creating a blanket covering the whole planet. So basically, that's a long way of saying yes, bacteria by any reasonable standard are alive.
Very interesting. And also, if for we spoke about the origins here, there also is a lot of thought put into could life have originated somewhere else and then was brought back in some form or the other to Earth. And I think you've covered this really well, where you've spoken about the experiments that astronauts have been conducting aboard the space station to run experiments to see how cells grow on in low Earth orbit. Were these experiments anything to do with trying to figure out whether these cells or any of life came into, let's say, our atmosphere, came from outside, or was this meant to see how we as a species, if we had to move out of Earth, what we would need to do? I just needed clarity on that.
Sure. So, I mean, so NASA and other space agencies are doing lots of experiments on space stations to try to understand how biology works when you leave our planet, because we really only know about it here. And so, the physical conditions, even in low Earth orbit, are very different than on Earth, and so that may lead to all sorts of different changes that we don't really understand. And so, these experiments could hopefully shed some light on that. You know what what happens to our bodies on a cellular level when we are out in space? What happens to our microbiome? We are home to trillions of bacteria. We depend on them and our relationship with them to stay healthy. What if some species starts multiplying out of control when you go out into space? Like that could be a terrible thing. So those are really, I would say, some of the key questions that scientists address when they try to do experiments in space. Um, but they some of these questions some of their findings can help to address some of these more far out questions about where life began, how it could have moved around. Um, it is conceivable that life did not start on Earth. I'm saying conceivable. You could imagine life beginning on Mars, for example, back when Mars was warm and wet. And then through impacts, material from Mars, rocks and whatnot, there was carrying microbes might have come to and fallen on Earth. We know that rocks from Earth land on Mars. I'm sorry, rocks from Mars land on Earth.
Mm,
Probably the other way too. But so we know that, so you can at least imagine that Martian microbes landed here and then took off. But to really explore that hypothesis, you do want to do experiments to understand how microbes survive in space. Not just inside a space station, but expose them to the vacuum of space. And so scientists have done some experiments like that on bacteria and other forms of life. And it's really hard out there.
yeah.
It's really brutal. There's a lot of radiation from the solar wind, but doesn't necessarily mean that everything would be wiped out.
True. And like you said, there are so many theories there. I don't think we'll be able to get through all of them in the time that we have. But now, fast forwarding back to life has taken off and we are here. But when I say we are here, if we go just back a little bit, at one given time, if I'm not mistaken, we had approximately, at last count, 12 to 14 types of humans. Prototypes. I would use the word as prototypes because you had the Homo erectus, you had the Homo sapien came in later, but you could put the Neanderthal in there as well. What I'm trying to get at is now that as Homo sapiens that we are here as probably the uni survivors, I think there's been so much of new data coming out where we've been sharing so much with all of them. And till some time back, we didn't even know that there was interbreeding with Neanderthals. But now that's pretty much everyone's quite clear about that, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's literally written in our DNA. One of the really amazing developments in biology in the past few decades has been the ability to uh, rescue DNA from fossils. Svante Pabo won a Nobel Prize for it recently, and rightly so, because it really has completely changed the way we look at life over the past few million years. And so we have these fossils of Neanderthals. They, if you just look at their bones, I mean, you can see that they were very much like modern humans, but different in some key ways. Their stockiness, some of the details of their skull anatomy and so on. Um, and their culture seemed to be different in some ways from the culture of what we call modern humans at the time, and they became extinct about 40,000 years ago. So there was all that information was there, and then it turned out you could get DNA out of their fossils, and then you could actually like get in the whole genome of a Neanderthal. So you're looking at billions and billions and billions of genetic letters, and then you can compare it to living species, and you can see that it shows that living humans and Neanderthals, they have a distinct history. They share, we share a common ancestor with Neanderthals, and maybe about 600,000 years ago, maybe more. And uh, after that divergence, you can actually see by analyzing all this DNA that actually there were several situations where people interbred with them. So modern humans, it appears they expanded several times out of Africa, but the probably the main waves were happening maybe 50 to 80,000 years ago, and there were encounters between modern humans and Neanderthals. There was interbreeding, and those hybrid children became part of modern human society because they then had children of their own, passed down these Neanderthal genes. These Neanderthal genes are still with us. So pretty much everyone on Earth has at least a little Neanderthal ancestry. It varies widely. There's relatively little in Africa among Africans, but if you go to some places in China or New Guinea, like you can actually get a few percent Neanderthal. So we have this legacy of them, and it's likely they were just one of a number of different um, lineages of humans, shall we say, that was around over the past few 100,000 years. We did not have this planet to ourselves by any means. And we probably interbred not just with Neanderthals, but with others. But at the same time, they're all gone, and we are the only ones left. And why that is we don't really have a firm answer on that.
Mm, Interestingly, because with so many around, and as humans, we do consider ourselves to be at pole position now because of what has happened in the past. But very interestingly, I was reading this article, and I don't know, again, you got to keep fact checking everything. So I think this is the right time to bring it up because there's an extinct species that buried their dead about 100,000 years ago before humans. So when we talk about culture and we talk about emotion, earlier we were talking about consciousness, this seems to be quite unique in some way to life because I do know that there have been instances of animals mourning the loss of a dead one. Somehow we tend to keep this quite unique to humans, but that may not actually be the case because this particular emotion or emotions generally seem to have uh, move from one species to the other as well, along with life.
Yeah. So in Life's Edge, I write about in part of the book about death. And if we're going to understand what life is, we also along the way have to understand what death is. And it is interesting to ask, well, okay, um, we think we can recognize death. So can other species? And it seems like at least some of them can. It seems that chimpanzees and some other primates, they behave differently around their dead kin, and then if they're just asleep or alive or something like that. And there have been these reports with elephants, for example, where there are these behaviors that, if you look at it, you might, it's not unreasonable to suggest that that's mourning, that they recognize that someone that an or another animal that was close to them, they spend a lot of time with, is no longer with them. And so so that doesn't seem to be limited to our species. Um, but there aren't any other living species that will actually, ceremonially bury their dead, or perform some sort of ritual. So that has long been sort of thought of as something that is the example of something that humans do that other species can't, and that it says something about our minds. Now, that has been challenged recently by scientists who have been exploring a cave in South Africa where there are thousands of fossil bones of a ancient human relative called Homo naledi. In a lot of ways, and it would have been about the size of, say, a chimpanzee, and had a very small brain, chimpanzee sized. Um, it's a very it seems very primitive. It had long arms. It looks like it was good at climbing trees, but these bones are in this cave, and they are not just in a cave. They're like way, way, way down, down, down in deep, deep chambers. And these scientists have now made a very controversial claim that it looks like these skeletons were buried, that they were brought down there, and then other Homo naledi dug a hole, put them in, covered the hole over, and then on top of that, made engravings on the wall. So these
Wow.
are these are very new claims. Homo naledi might have lived 300,000 years ago, maybe 400. It's not really precise yet, but long before, really modern humans. They're not our ancestors. They're just another branch on the human tree. But these are such extraordinary claims that a lot of other scientists say, well, you're going to have to do better than that. They want more data. They want more experiments. They want more, just because these are such controversial claims. So the jury is definitely still out.
Yep, like you said, they need extraordinary evidence as well now. And getting to your concept of, if we need to understand life, then we do need to understand death as well. And I think for the first time, I read about something or got to know about a particular situation where people can lose sense of what it feels like to be alive without actually dying. I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, so I think I talk about this in the book, that there is this condition where people actually believe that they are dead. Um, and, the reason that I talk about it is because we tend to think of life and death as sort of kind of objective conditions that we just recognize through just rational observation. Um, and that's not actually really what our relationship with life and death is like. we our brains seem to be very tuned to recognizing the signs of living things. For example, when something is moving around, our brains will respond quickly and differently if it's an animal moving around versus just a rock or something that's not biological. And that makes that makes a lot of evolutionary sense in the sense that, like, you wanted to be constantly on the lookout and being able to respond very quickly to predators. And you don't have time to be like, there's some there's a pattern of light there, and the colors and stuff are moving, and let me think about that. Does that look like it might be, some sort of living thing? And if it is a living thing, is that a predator that and so I like, there's no time for questions. It's like, if a leopard is charging at you, you want to just run. And so we have these sort of circuits for recognizing biological activity, and we also like have our own sense that we ourselves are alive. And we a lot of the sensory information that comes into our brains is not just what's coming into our eyes or in our ears, but it's like our internal state. All our organs, our muscles, and so on, they're constantly sending information up into our brains. Like, here's how things are going, and things are going well, or there's a pain, or there's all sorts of different things that are being processed by your brain about your body's internal state. So when you feel alive, you really are feeling alive. It's not, when you know what it means, to be alive, I would argue, well, you know what it means to feel that you're alive. And these people who think that they're dead, they really illustrate that, because they are having lesions or some other disorder that disrupts their brain's circuits for monitoring their own internal state. They're not getting it. It appears like they're not getting that information, and so their brain is like, well, if I'm not feeling alive, then I must be dead. It's a surreal, fascinating, and terrifying condition. It's very rare, but there are many, many case studies of it. So it's a real thing, and I find it fascinating.
True. And I guess with the brain as well, what the brain is doing is continuously updating information and then probably predicting what happens next to give us a more realistic view or a realistic feeling of what is happening in the present. But are we ever there? Because as humans, what we see around us, and that's as far as our reality is concerned, it's just our brain continuously upgrading what it sees, finds a pattern that is familiar, keeps it. If it's not familiar, it loses it. You spoke about evolution and why we needed to do this, because we just had that split second to escape. I mean, and humans even more so, because we did not have any defense mechanism uh, before we could even come up with any tools. So for us, it was even more important that we had to make these quick judgment calls, which were to an extent based on something predicting what reality was going to be like in the future.
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, a lot of neuroscientists look at brains as prediction machines. That they are making predictions about how the world works and what the best course of action would be, and then they're just constantly updating all of that as new information comes in. But that's true. That's not just true for people. I mean, that's true for earthworms. That's just, I mean, it seems like it's a general property of brains and nervous systems. Um, and so it is interesting to think about how humans and the human brain evolves from that sort of basic function. Some people have argued that the key to human brain evolution was social evolution. In other words, that our ancestors were, lived in large groups and needed to cooperate to get food and to share food. And so you just had these larger and larger societies that were getting more and more complex. And, you needed to be making predictions about not just, is that leopard over there going to jump on me, but like, uh, if I share some of these tubers that I dug up, is this person going to be nice to me? Are they going to share some of their food when I need it? So it's possible that we're particularly good. Our brains are particularly good social prediction machines.
True. And you mentioned as because of this, as we needed to cooperate as groups and larger groups. But if we come to the present day, this cooperation has definitely we've taken it to a large extent and gone global now, with so much of information around us, with the ability to check and fact check. So why do you think there is this division now with what one group of people tend to think and believe, and what one group of people tend to think and not want to believe? And it doesn't even seem to be based around fact anymore.
Um, I I don't think that this is anything particularly new. I mean, I think that people have been split about the nature of reality for centuries, and to think that there was a golden age is just not something that I don't think is particularly helpful. We definitely do have problems with how we sort of share a view of reality these days. I agree with that, and it's important um, to push back on that. I think, I mean, in a way, I think that our expectation of that shared reality is partly a product of modern science. The scientific process involves um, sharing findings, being able to argue about them, and then being able to move forward with a better account of reality. But that none of that works if people don't agree on the basic um, ground rules. And so just to what one example these days has to do with vaccines. How do we know that vaccines are safe and effective? Well, to that involves clinical trials, and there were not clinical trials 120 years ago. Clinical trials were developed through the development of modern statistics and all sorts of modern scientific concepts. They're very powerful. They work very well, but you have to sort of understand the logic behind them to be able to make sense of them. So people will say like, "Oh, well, um, sometimes I will hear people who want to deny that the Pfizer COVID vaccine works. Will say, well, there were people who got the Pfizer vaccine who died in addition to people who got the placebo who died, and that sort of thing is a fundamental misunderstanding of how trials work, because um, the trial was not actually, because so few people die of anything over the course of a few months. These trials were not actually statistically designed to detect whether there was a reduction in the risk of death. They weren't even looking for that. What they were looking for was, is there a reduction in infection? Now, you can't die of COVID if you don't get it, but that you have to understand with these trials what they were designed for and what the statistics allow. So so it is. I do think it's incredibly important that everybody um, learn about some of these fundamentals, because otherwise, if you hear someone on a podcast saying like, "Oh, well, these 10 people in the Pfizer trial died, so therefore these vaccines are useless," you are being misled, and you need those tools to say like, "Wait a minute, that's not right. This person is misleading me."
True, Carl. I think that's really important. And if I could just ask you, as a science communicator as well, and probably the best science communicator in the world today, do we, or do you think that when it comes to, so we reached a situation of the vaccines and people having their view of reality, but maybe we need to do this better, and we need to do this more. When I say we need to do this, I mean people who are communicating science probably make it a little bit more accessible and a little bit more easy for people to understand, because as humans, the more story we put around it, the easier it is going to be for people to understand, because everybody, 90% of the people, are not born with the kind of IQ or logical reasoning or critical thinking that goes into a particular scientific field when somebody follows it. So, do you also think that as a scientific community, and when I say scientific community, I mean everybody who's involved, we also probably, this has been a good time for us to realize that we need to communicate a little bit more, and we need to put out what we are doing a little bit easy, so people on the street can actually understand. They don't need to really get into the detail of the result, but at least when something this serious happens, it's easier for that person to then accept it.
Well, I mean, that's certainly, making, certainly conveying sort of the key findings of scientists and the key ideas, the key principles in a way that you don't have to be a scientist to understand. I think, I mean, that's incredibly important to me. I mean, that's certainly what I try to do every day. And so it's certainly important. Do we need to do that more? Honestly, like I feel like I just, to me, these days it feels like there are a lot of arsonists out there setting fires. And so to say like, well, you firemen need to be like, you need to be just, putting more water on these fires. Why aren't you putting out these fires more? I, like, obviously, like, the firefighters need to put out the fires. That's their job. But maybe the problem is that what are is all these arsonists. I mean,
Hmm.
there are people who are just, every day are promoting nonsense about things like vaccines, things like global warming. They are actively doing it, and they're making a good living doing it too. And so, I could we do more? Sure, but I think that that's kind of missing the bigger picture.
True. There has to be there, but it has to start somewhere, and I think it can be inculcated. Especially the way I look at it is, it just needs a little bit more literature. It just needs a little bit more to be accepted as well. And you were mentioning earlier as well that if there is a particular theory and we need people to either follow it, then you need proof. In this current scenario that we've just been through, I think there was enough of proof as well, right? Because there was no, I mean, what was the alternative? So when you talk about these kind of habits, you have to logically think of it. But anyway, getting on to where we were just before this, I think I would like to know a little bit more about a very interesting story, if you can share with us, about James Forbes, who boarded the ship in England in 1765. He sailed for Bombay, which was Bombay at that time, Mumbai, which is Mumbai today. And why did you want to tell us that story? What was so special about it for you?
So Forbes, as in his work, um, for one of the British companies that was colonizing India at the time, would travel around the subcontinent a lot, and he would draw pictures and take notes, and he returned back to Europe and published books that were quite well received, because to British people, here was this colony that was obviously they were extracting lots of resources from and getting very rich off of, but nobody really knew what it was, and so this was almost like a virtual tour. And there's one story in there that that was actually quite influential, which was this experience that Forbes had, um, or this story that he got about a British hunter um, who was sort of beset upon by some. His camp was sort of beset upon by some monkeys. He shot one of the monkeys, and the other monkeys seemed to be very upset. At least that's how he saw it. And then he actually just essentially returned the body of that dead monkey to the troop, which then took it away. Charles Darwin was very struck by this story. Other European naturalists were struck by it. And this actually kind of led to this, built up this idea that maybe humans are not the only ones who feel grief at the death of a close individual. So that's a very early example. I should say that, like, um, obviously, like, everyone around the world has had their own histories and cultural histories of experiences around life and death and what it means to be alive and so on. Because I was focused very much on sort of how modern science has addressed these questions. When I look, I tend to be highlighting more sort of European or American roots of all this than other cultures like India, for example. That's not to imply that that somehow people in India have no thoughts or experiences about any of this. And it's just that was that in order to sort of carve out a manageable chunk of work as a writer that I felt that I could really take on. That was the approach I took in the book, but I just want to kind of make that clear for any readers.
True. And thanks to you, we also now have the third state between life and death, which is cryptobiosis, right?
Yeah, cryptobiosis is really fascinating. I'm fascinated by these conditions that really challenge our simple binary of life and death. We think that, well, what is life? Well, it's everything that isn't death. And what is death? Well, it's the end of life, and that's it. But the fact is that many animals, plants, especially microbes, can go into it's not you could call it like a state of suspended animation, but that doesn't even really get at just how amazing it is. Essentially, like take for example, and there's an animal called a tardigrade, sometimes called a water bear, barely visible to the naked eye, lives in soils and water. It can actually withstand droughts and other harsh conditions by going into this cryptobiosis state for decades, maybe centuries. And what it does is it actually alters its own cells. It creates proteins that have some of the properties of glass, and so they basically encase their DNA and their essential proteins and just lock them into place. And they can withstand radiation. They can be sent into outer space. You can pretty much do anything you want to a tardigrade once it's in this state. And then when the water returns and when conditions get better, the glass goes away. The DNA starts to be used to express proteins. The proteins start to carry out reactions. It basically, like, it's just the way it was before. It wasn't dead. It definitely wasn't alive. It was something else.
This is this is really so interesting. This this particular state of cryptobiosis, like you said, this is very interesting. And so when you come out of that state, or for you to come out of that state, and I'm talking about a living being, you also cover something that's called the is it the ATP molecules that are needed to push or give a real pump back into the living system for us to get our metabolism going again. Is this connected to this particular state, or is this something else that I'm trying to connect?
Well, ATP is the fuel for all of life, and it's probably like when life began on Earth, it used ATP. There's energy contained in the molecule that our cells use to power chemical reactions, to so that our cells can do things that you just wouldn't see in ordinary matter. And so,
Sorry, what I meant was for this particular species to get back from this third state, was there an enhanced quantity of ATP that was needed, or it comes in all together?
I have not seen studies that look at the ATP production that comes about when cryptobiosis is ending. It's an interesting question. Um, but the ATP would be preserved, but in the sort of protein glass I was speaking of, it just sort of gets locked into place and protected. It just doesn't do it can't do anything because the what you know another important thing about all this is that like water is really essential for a lot of these reactions to take place. And in something like a tardigrade, the water disappears, and actually, the water is actually replaced by these other substances. So, so the ATP is still there. It just can't do anything. It can't react to yield the energy that you need for these processes, and it just can start up again once the tardigrade comes back to life.
Right. Now, for the different species that you cover and that you have studied, or the ideas that you have as far as life is concerned, it's such a huge and vast topic or subject. And obviously, for us to even be having this conversation and reflecting or introspecting onto what we are doing here, the fact of intelligence does come into play. And what, according to you, is intelligence? Has intelligence led us to what we are currently doing right here, right now? Or would I say, for example, the ultimate species that finally survives everything is the most intelligent species, though it may not have gone technologically forward?
Um, so intelligence as a concept, emerged in the 19th century, 20th century, when psychologists were trying to judge how people performed certain kinds of tasks that were deemed in places like England to be of the most value. And so, so it's not a it did not have its beginnings as some sort of pure abstract notion. It was very much a cultural artifact. And so that makes talking about intelligence very problematic because of how we then try to define it. Nevertheless, I mean, I think there is still a value in talking about it. Um, you know, I would say that, one general way that people have come to talk about intelligence is sort of complex cognition. In other words, being able to look at the world around us and to then be able to take that information to make a plan, to solve a problem, things like that. Um, but if you define it that way, then humans are not unique in having intelligence. Animals are intelligent. They have problems to solve. They solve them. And in Life's Edge, I actually argue that you can look down to very quote unquote simple life forms and see an intelligence in them. Um, you need to if you are alive, you need to be able to get around in the world. You need to be able to get food. You need to be able to get away from danger. In other words, you need to respond to your environment better than random. Um, and one example I give is these things called slime molds, which you may see sprouting from the ground in a walk in the woods. They're basically like giant masses of protoplasm. They're sort of like these cells that kind of join together into these networks of that inside of which proteins flow around, and they can do all sorts of amazing things. They can solve math problems. They can navigate mazes.
Yeah.
They don't have nervous systems. They don't have brains, but they can do all these things. All these things that you would think are a form of intelligence. So I would say that when we talk about intelligence, we tend to be talking about how do people do on an exam. I would say that it's more fruitful to think about how living things make decisions about how to survive. And in that respect, all of life is intelligent.
Mm, I don't know if you've ever seen that video on the ant colony that they uncovered. They kept digging, and there were these scientists that were pouring in some liquid so they could isolate the actual channels that the ants were using. And it was just unbelievable. I don't know if you've ever seen that, but you're just thinking about an ant, a single ant, and then you're thinking about an ant colony. But here you've got not only a city, you've got a metropolitan city with channels and blobs. It is just amazing as to what were the ants actually thinking when they were doing it, because the end product was, it does ask you questions, or you do question yourself about intelligence and the purpose of it.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, ants definitely are a great example of intelligence that works in a way that we're not familiar with. So ants do have, each of them does have a brain, but it's just tens of thousands of neurons, as opposed to whatever it is, 80 billion neurons or something like that in the human brain. So just a tiny little smidgen of processing power in each ant's brain. But if you combine thousands of ants together, they can collectively solve problems. They can build these incredibly intricate nests. Um, one even more remarkable in some ways is sort of how they move together collectively. So you can see these
Mm,
videos of ants that they are moving across the forest floor, and they need to get across like a large gap. And basically what they will do is the ants themselves will some of the ants will turn themselves, join together and form a bridge that the other ants can use to walk across. Um, it is,
that's
and
amazing.
there's no individual ant gets a message saying like, okay, you're going to be helping to make the bridge. You are going to go out 2 inches from the edge of here, and then you will be, that will be your place. It's all emergent out of very simple rules that each individual ant follows. But out of that,
But then, if I could ask you, just sorry for interrupting, but then wouldn't that be part of, you spoke earlier about the DNA? So does that kind of information or knowledge, is that not encoded in DNA, or is there any other way it's coming in from?
there is information encoded in DNA, and ultimately what you get from these ants that carry that DNA is these behaviors where they are making cathedral-like nests and building their own bridges and so on. But you would never be able to find a gene for building bridges. You might,
Mm,
you will find genes that make proteins that influence the length of neurons and the kinds of neurotransmitters that each neuron can produce. And just by subtly adjusting those things through natural selection, you can produce these emergent patterns that come out. That they're not in the gene, they're not in the individual ant. They only emerge when you get these thousands of ants together acting collectively.
mm. So behavior is never encoded in genes. If that is true, then comes in what we also, or what you also spoke about earlier, is this behavior. Yes, environment and culture is important, but then we get into hereditary genes or hereditary behavior.
Behavior certainly is, um, the differences in, well, it really all depends on what you mean by behavior, I should say. Um, you can look from one species
Mm.
to another, and you can see differences in between species. Um,
Anger, short temper. Let's just,
well,
I'm
you
just
can you can
in
look at
humans.
then you can look at individuals within a species and say, well, okay, why do if our own species, why do some people behave differently than others? And scientists have done very large scale studies where they look for genetic variants that are more common in people with certain kinds of behavior than you'd expect by chance. And you do find them sometimes, but
Mm.
when you work through the math, any one of those genes would have an incredibly tiny influence on the difference in that behavior. So having that one variant alone doesn't really make much difference. In other words, there are
Mm.
thousands of genes that
And
influence behavior, but they only influence. They may, depending on the behavior you're talking about, they may only account collectively for a few percent of the variation that you see. What's the rest? Well, it's the environment and how those genes play out in that environment.
true. And this information that is stored in the double helix, so in the DNA, the AGBT, where did that come from?
Well, um, information really. When scientists talk about information, they're not necessarily talking about it the way that we might talk about it in sort of everyday conversation. It's not like, I mean, there's information in a recipe in a cookbook, but when scientists talk about information, they may talk about, well, um, how much uncertainty about one thing is reduced if you know about another thing. So um, so it's the nature of chemistry that if you've got a string of DNA and certain kinds of proteins, that you can make RNA, or you can even make a protein out of that stretch of DNA. Now, whether that protein
Mm.
does anything that affects the behavior of an organism, or improves its fitness, that's a separate issue. Um, but we have there are lots of but new genes with functions are evolving all the time. You might, for example, we have hundreds of genes that make the receptors on the neurons in our noses that help us smell. Those new genes, in that case, come about because as DNA is being copied, the one olfactory receptor gene might accidentally get duplicated. So now you have two copies. And then later, initially, like they both are making the same receptor, but then mutations arise, and now the second receptor gene is a little different and makes the receptor is slightly different. That might be really helpful if it helps you to smell something you couldn't smell before, or it might not matter. And so, in addition to a lot of working copies of these genes that help us smell, we actually have a lot of copies of these genes that don't do anything. They're broken. They acquired mutations and made them stop working, but that's all right because we didn't really need them. So they're still in our genome.
Mm,
They're right there. So the way that new genes arise and gain function, it's a constant process, and it's um, but what the outcome is different depending on the situation.
mm. And putting all this together, of course, is the life form that you and me and everybody is talking about and trying to figure out. Then, do you agree with the NASA definition of life, which is life is a self sustained chemical system capable of undergoing Darwinian evolution? Is that what you think is the right way we should be approaching
Yeah,
this
so that
subject?
is maybe one of the most influential or popular definitions out there. It was a group of scientists who came together for NASA at a meeting just to talk about looking for life on other planets. Decided they needed a working definition, and that's what they came up with. And it's certainly elegant, but but scientists since then have pointed out problems, shortcomings, and viruses, for example, are not alive according to that. And I think that's kind of problematic because you can't just somehow set viruses aside as having nothing to do with life. But I don't think that, as they argue in the book, I don't think that we'll really make much progress bickering about which definition is better than another and which is the best definition. What we need is a theory of life in the way that we have, say, a theory of superconductivity. How is it that under certain conditions matter takes on certain unusual properties? So we have a theory of superconductivity. We don't have a theory of life, and once we do, then I think the definitions will be trivial.
Right. And being involved in the scientific field with the scientific community, doing it yourself, researching and putting out stuff that you want to, as well as being such a eloquent communicator to people listening to you. And when I say people, Carl, I mean it could be a student who's just 10, 12, 14, 15, 20 years old and listening to this conversation that you are putting out. If you had to pass a message on to everyone, what would that kind of a message be in the current environment that we are in? Because a lot of us at the age and stage that we are going to find it very difficult to think any other way. But I think there is a generation out there who will be much more influenced by what you have to say, and I specifically want you to address that generation. What would you want to tell them as far as tools or tips on how to think right? Because I know universities, schools and colleges teaches everything, but one aspect of life that nobody teaches us is how do you think right? And why don't you tell us how you want all of us to think right?
um, I I don't think I can be that presumptuous. I mean, I would just encourage young people to um to get to know the natural world. I mean, it's very tempting to just stay on our phones and our computers, but We are surrounded by an astonishing planet full of millions of species, which each is astonishing in its own way. And we there's so much that so many more surprises that are left to be discovered about them. And our planet is just one of many, many, many planets that are orbiting stars, and in this vast, remarkable universe. And so I think if people open themselves up to that surprise and that wonder, I think it's something that will benefit you for the rest of your life. Does that mean that you become a scientist? Well, maybe, perhaps it's just you can't imagine doing anything else but understanding how the ocean works, or maybe you want to use that knowledge to help people, to save lives by figuring out how to cut down on air pollution, which kills millions of people every year. But you don't have to be a scientist. I'm not a scientist, to appreciate these things and to let it have meaning in your life. I think we're all entitled to have access to all of this. So I guess that's what my message would be.
Right. And to everybody listening, I definitely have read your book, Carl, The Life's Edge. And truly, it was absolutely amazing. There's so much of new information in there. And the way you've plotted it, where you've gone sequentially, giving live examples of not only thought processes, but how thought processes change, what happens after that. And I think we spoke about a few of the cases earlier. So I definitely would recommend anybody listening to this, if you've enjoyed this, I'm sure you have, you definitely need to pick up a copy of Life's Edge. It's available here in India as well on Amazon, if it's something that you like to do online, or through a bookstore. But once again, Carl, it's been such a pleasure speaking to you, and from everybody here in India on Indian Genes, thank you so much for your time, your patience, and I just hope if we can ever do this again, I just hope you decide and come back and speak to us again, Carl.
I enjoyed the conversation very much. Thank you so much for having me on your show.
इस हब हॉपर ओरिजिनल को सुनने के लिए आपका शुक्रिया। अगर आप भी अपना पॉडकास्ट लॉन्च करना चाहते हैं तो हब हॉपर स्टूडियो वेबसाइट पे रजिस्टर करें और 1 मिनट के अंदर अंदर अपना खुद का पॉडकास्ट लॉन्च करें। यही नहीं, स्टूडियो देता है आपको पूरी आजादी कहीं भी कभी भी अपना पॉडकास्ट लॉन्च करने की, सिर्फ 3 आसान स्टेप्स में। तो साथ में अपना पॉडकास्ट शुरू करने के लिए तैयार? जस्ट हॉप ऑन हब हॉपर, सिंपली कंटेंट।